I want you to watch this video. There should be audio on this next video of a Kansas Republican. Take a listen in.
What you really need to do is go back in the 30s and when they outlawed all types of drugs in Kansas across the United States. What was the reason why they did that? One of the reasons why, I hate to say it, it's the African Americans. They were basically users, and they basically responded the worst of all those drugs, just because their character makeup, their genetics and that.
That video is crazy to me. It's very difficult to hear, but this is a Republican, Kansas Republican, who is explaining his opposition to legalizing marijuana. And in his explanation to legalize marijuana, he said that the reason that he opposes it is because African Americans, if you go back and look in the 30s, African Americans, they react weird. They react to it. He said their genetics. It's really, he said the African Americans, they were basically users, and they basically responded the worst off to those drugs just because of their character makeup, their genetics, and that stuff. I actually have to pause to laugh about that because I had a chance to talk about this on the afternoon show, I think about 2 days ago. And I wanted to talk about this yesterday with you, but I didn't get a chance to because we ran out of time. But there is a baseline level of bigotry against African Americans, people of color in general, but specifically African Americans, that is accepted as truth by some elected officials. I'm not even concerned about the average American at this point. I'm concerned about the people who are in positions of power. People who are in positions of power and have the ability to affect our lives, they carry some bigotry with them that is older than them. This guy was referencing propaganda from the 1930s, where it basically laid at the feet of all African Americans the problem of marijuana. They were creating a problem of marijuana because, as we now know, marijuana is not addictive. Marijuana is not, I don't even have to list the things, but it was an intentional propaganda campaign launched in the 1930s that this Kansas Republican state representative was speaking about. Now, he's resigned from his chairmanships in the state party in the state house, but he has not resigned from his position. He's not resigned from his office. And he's pulling up this old propaganda that is so deeply rooted in him that he could, off the top of his head, refer to the exact year that this propaganda campaign began. I talked about Harry J. Anslinger, who was the first chairman of the Bureau of Narcotics in the Treasury Department. And this is the campaign that he started in the 1930s, literally saying some of the same things that this guy said just a few weeks ago. The problem is that we somewhere between, 1964 and today, somewhere between those 2 points, I think we forgot how deeply rooted this problem of bigotry and racism is with a lot of conservative white Americans. Don't get me wrong, there's racism in liberal America. We'll address that when the story comes that's appropriate for me to address it. But right now, think of how deeply rooted this had to be in this man to hold on to this and to bring it up off the top of his head. I mean, for this to be a drop of the dime talking point to reference the exact year that this propaganda campaign began in 1930, this is something that he has ruminated over for a very long time. This means this is a deeply held belief. And somewhere along the way, we forgot how deeply rooted this racism is in the United States of America. We see the symptoms of it. We talk about the symptoms all the time. We see the backlash from police officers. We see, the backlash from white voters. We see the police abuse by police officers. We see, the movement Black Lives Matter came out as a result. We see the symptoms, but did we really ever consider or protest or address how deeply rooted this stuff really is? Here's another example of how I know we kind of lost track of how deeply rooted this is that majority of our elected officials now, who are between the ages of 60 and 80, they were alive and well during Jim Crow. They were alive and well before the 1964-1965 Voting Rights Act and Voting Civil Rights Act. They were alive and well. And so they were born into and groomed and raised in a system of Jim Crow and white supremacy. And yet we're surprised or taken aback or just neglected to address the fact that most of our elected officials who were in in Congress and Senate on the federal level, and they're in their House and the Senate seats on the state level, most of them, if you're over the age of 60, you were alive and well. Think about the president. He's 70 years old. He was alive. He was alive and groomed before, 72? Yeah, before Brown versus Board of Education. What was he born in by? He had to be born in 42, 43, or actually, 44 or 45. So they grew up in this time, indoctrinated in this time. And so at what point, we really have to ask the question, what point did they have a change of heart? A change of mind, a change. When did they come across the aisle and come from the side of opposition to the Voting Rights and the Civil Rights Act? Because, I'm sorry, if you were in your teens or if you were in your 20s when the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act were passed, that means you had an opinion. That means that you had an opinion that you probably inherited from your parents. So at what point did they grow out of that hatred and that bigotry? That's the question. And I don't think that we've ever taken the time to pause and answer that question or even pose that question to the people like the man in the video I just played. Because he referenced a piece of propaganda that is so old and so deeply rooted in America that we're still trying to dispel those notions today, some 80 years later. He referenced that propaganda like it was yesterday, like it was a matter of fact, like it was a statement of fact of relevance today. And it just makes me beg the question, when did they ever let go of that racism? Or did they just simply say, okay, we can't be outwardly racist? Of course, the clear answer everyone is going to say is B, right? Option B that I just gave you. But these are our elected officials. Let's just do an experiment. Let's do an experiment. Let's see how old Mitch McConnell is. Let's see what year he was born. And we can tell you everything that happened before. He's 75 years old. He was born in 1942, before Brown versus the Board of Education, which means he was in school when schools started to be integrated. And you have to ask the question, what were his parents like? What were they indoctrinating him with? Because at that time, it's such a critical time in American history, such a polarized time in American history, where you had elementary school students who were virulent about their racism. And I'm sorry, I am not saying that people can't change over time, but I'm saying I think we forget how old our leaders are and where they grew up, more specifically, when they grew up. So in 1942, he was born, which means in 1964, he was 22 years old. Just checking my mind. 1964, he was 22 years old. He had a fully formed worldview and ideology. At that point, he thought he knew it all. The question is, what did he think in 1964 and 1965? Let's check somebody else. Paul Ryan would be too young. Paul Ryan would be one of the few leaders, but let's not take that for granted. Let's see what year he was born. Probably in the 70s, right? Yeah, he was born in 1970. So he's exempt from this analysis with few exceptions. But think about all the leaders who are over the age of 65, who are still serving in power. Joe Arpaio's 85. Shit, I mean, he's 85 running for the Senate. I mean, legitimately was a part of the Jim Crow era. I think we really forget exactly how deeply rooted these ideologies can be and why it's so simple for elected officials to hearken back to propaganda that is to us ancient, but to them, it was relevant in the formation of their youth.